Good afternoon, 8th graders. You might as well get to know some of my family. This little boy is Panzer. He's a cute little guy. We got him in Wisconsin, but he's a tabby, and he's a cutie pie. He's a little lover. So I'll let him down now. All right, we're going to start on page 720. We're going to do a little short lecture about this section here. The big question was, how much government control should the federal government have? Historically, the federal government had been less involved in people's lives until the Great Depression and World War II. But under the Truman administration, he wanted to continue expanding the role of government to help people as much as possible. He wanted to spend money on low-income housing. He wanted to provide national health insurance, which if it had passed back then, we wouldn't have the problems we have right now. We'd all be used to it. But unfortunately for him, the Congress was controlled by the Republicans, and they did not necessarily want to expand the role of federal government. Now, there's a term you need to know. It's called gross national product. And gross national product is the value of all goods and services produced in the United States during a certain period of time. They measure it quarterly, every 3 months. And when the GNP expands, that's good. When it retracts, it's called a recession. Okay, right now, because of COVID, it is retracting, so we are entering a recession period of time. Hopefully, it won't last too long. Some of Truman's economic policies. Remember, the GI Bill helped a lot of veterans after World War II get what they needed. The government spent more money buying military equipment, too, because of the Cold War. And more people were hired in the military industries. Price controls had been in effect during World War II. However, they were removed, and so what happened was prices shot up, which meant that there was a period of what was called inflation. Inflation is when the value of money drops and prices go up. Okay, that's what inflation is. Okay, so inflation quickly increased to 25%. So something that cost $1 now costs $1.25. So it really shot up during this period of time. People blamed the Democrats and Truman for the inflation, and so they voted a lot of Republicans into Congress. However, the inflation was just a natural consequence of the price controls during World War II. The prices just naturally went up. There was an increase in minimum wage that took place at this time to try to offset that. It went up from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour. That's how much they were making. So anyhow, so that was what was going on. So there was some inflation. Then in 1948, there was an election, and the Republican candidate was a guy named Thomas Dewey. And Truman was very unpopular, even more unpopular than President Trump is right now. And everybody thought for sure that Dewey was going to win the election. He was a bit overconfident, and he didn't probably campaign as well as he should have, but Truman did. And so what happened was one of the most shocking upsets in presidential election history, and that was Truman was elected again for another term in 1948. Shocked everybody. And there's a famous picture in your book in the upper left that shows Truman holding up a newspaper headline, I think from Chicago, that says "Dewey defeats Truman." They were so confident about it that they went ahead and ran the story, but Truman was the winner of the election. In the years 1948 through 52, the Democratic-controlled Congress did pass some measures to control the economy. So the Democrats got control of the Congress again. Now, one of the things that Truman did was his social policies were somewhat progressive. Unfortunately for him, the only significant social legislation was a new housing law that led to the creation of many new public housing projects. Okay. 1952, Truman did not run again, and the Republicans had General Eisenhower run for them, and he won pretty easily. He is my mom's favorite president. When my mom was alive, she always used to tell me that she loved Eisenhower, and his campaign button said, "We like Ike." Okay, now he's the president that was in office when I was born in 1959, so we're getting close to a period when I was alive. Okay, not quite yet though. Things were going pretty well initially, but then there was a recession, which I already told you was when the economy declines for a while. It recedes. That's the name, recession. And so Eisenhower, they tried to do what they could. They decreased the interest rates. Remember I told you to increase the economy, you lower the interest rates. That's the accelerator, by lowering the interest rates. And to slow the economy down, if there's too much inflation, you raise the interest rates so people don't want to borrow more money and spend it. So what they did was they accelerated the economy by lowering interest rates. Eisenhower increased government spending on public projects. They built the St. Lawrence Seaway, which connected the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. And in 1956, Congress passed the Federal Highway Act. And it was the largest works policy in American history, was building the interstate highways that we have today. And so Eisenhower was responsible for that. The Social Security Act was amended to provide coverage and increase benefits for more Americans. Unfortunately, by 1960, when I was about a year old, 20% of all Americans were still considered poor. They were in poverty. They had little money, little education, and no medical care. So that was a problem that the country was going to have to address. Now, the big issue in the United States was fear of communism, the Red Scare, basically. After World War II, the government decided that they would have people to figure out if they were loyal or not. Now, they were afraid there were subversives in the government. Now, a subversive is a person who works secretly to overthrow the government, okay? And there were a lot of people afraid that there were communists that actually had gotten into the federal government and were working against the government. The FBI collected information on over 3 million Americans and conducted 10,000 full investigations. Although not one person was found to be spying for the Soviets, 378 people were fired from government jobs because evidence made them look suspicious. All right, now, in 1938, prior to World War II, there had been a committee that was established called the House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC. And after the war, during the early stages of the Cold War, it became very active because more and more people, especially in Hollywood, were being suspected of being either communists or favorable to communism. So the HUAC was calling a lot of people to testify before Congress. Okay, and a lot of them were Hollywood actors. Now, the problem was whether or not they were communists or supported communism or were just liberals, the fact was that the Hollywood movie companies took action against them. They made a blacklist, what was called a blacklist. What's it called? I didn't hear you, but that's okay because I'm on the other side of this computer. Anyhow, a blacklist, they listed people who they suspected were communists, and they were not allowed to get jobs in Hollywood, so it destroyed their careers. They weren't allowed to work for the next 15 years, which is like half of a career. The most famous thing that happened during this period was the Alger Hiss case. I love his last name, Hiss. Okay, Alger Hiss. In 1949, he was accused of passing secrets on to the Soviet Union. He worked for the State Department. And Richard Nixon, a young congressman from California who would later become president, he helped lead the investigation. Hiss denied the charges, but he was convicted, and he spent many years in prison before he was finally pardoned. Now, whether or not he spied or whatever, we don't know entirely for sure. But there was a lot of suspicion back then that he did. Another thing that was passed was the Internal Security Act. We were really paranoid during this time. And so if you worked for the government, the state government, local organizations, whatever, you had to report to the government if you were associated with any organizations that might be friendly toward communism. And over 150 professors at the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, were fired because they refused to sign the loyalty oath. They said, this is America. We don't have to do that. We have freedom of thought, freedom of speech. So they lost their jobs. So the Internal Security Act was kind of scary. W.E.B. Du Bois, who led the NAACP, the leading civil rights organization, he was prohibited from traveling abroad, going to other countries, simply because he was assumed to be a communist. 1950, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were convicted of spying for the Soviet Union. They were sentenced to death and eventually executed. It's the first time in American history that happened, that somebody was executed during peacetime for treason. It's still controversial, and a lot of people think that they were convicted because they were Jews. They were Jewish. They did definitely send stuff to the Soviet Union. Whether or not they should have been executed, that is, open to a point of view. Probably not, because it was peacetime. Then along came a Wisconsin senator, I'm ashamed to say, Joseph McCarthy. And he began to make accusations. He made a list of 205 alleged communists who were working in the State Department. He didn't show anybody the list, but he said there's 205 people. And so the Senate began to have hearings into their loyalty. And initially he was very popular with the people. He attacked large government departments and wealthy people who worked in those departments. So this appealed to the working class people. Well, basically, he got out of control. This went on for a few years, and he kept widening the search for these alleged communists in government. And then he made a big mistake. He attacked the army. He said there were people in the army who were communists. And President Eisenhower, who had been the general in charge of the army, didn't like that. He said, whoa, Joe, slow down. And so he started to bring pressure against McCarthy. Eventually, an attorney of one of the accused soldiers confronted McCarthy and made him look foolish because he didn't have any evidence. He had very little evidence. And Eisenhower was angry by this time at McCarthy. So Eisenhower encouraged McCarthy's critics in the Senate to condemn McCarthy's behavior. And in December 1954, the Senate voted 67-22 to reprimand McCarthy for his unethical behavior. As a result, he lost prestige and he no longer had influence in the Senate. He eventually died of cancer. He was an alcoholic. Well, he gave us a word that we still have in the English dictionary today. It's called McCarthyism. And what McCarthyism is, it's making accusations against people, especially political accusations, when you have no evidence against them. You try to destroy their careers without actually presenting the evidence, concrete evidence. McCarthyism was the result of a panic over communism. Another result of the efforts to find communists was that people became reluctant to talk openly about the problems in American society. People pointing out problems in the United States had often been labeled as communists. The lack of discussion about problems eventually led to a public which was poorly informed. A lack of awareness would lead America into very difficult situations in the 1960s. So people were really kind of afraid to talk about some of the problems and talk about politics because of McCarthyism. So that, ladies and gentlemen, takes us up through 728. Hopefully this lecture helped. I will be giving you a review lecture. We will be having our chapter 27 test next week. But I've got one more lecture about civil rights for you guys. So anyhow, have a good day. Bye.